Chapter 5, the Core XY Assembly. Welcome to Barrett Works. I think this chapter is the mechanically most interesting chapter. You might call it the most involved or difficult. It's when we take the square stamped metal frame, that is the upper structure in the printer, and populate it with all of the Core XY hardware, all the moving hardware. I'll even call it kind of fun. This is also the first chapter where I made a more organized effort to read all of the comments in the Prusa instructions ahead of time. And in the process, I ended up generating 31 notes of my own, marking steps in the process where I was going to do something slightly different from what Prusa had described. Do a step out of order, or add something to it, or modify it in one way or the other. I've also printed, before I did this chapter, I had printed 2 modified parts. Actually, one is a set of 2 parts that I did a modified version of, the belt tensioners. And I used the posting up in printables from Chris Hill for that, the Core One belt tensioner pulley, where it's been modified to take a heat insert instead of a square nut. And then I also went with a modified version of the Core One bed stop. Kazauer has a design up on printables, switching from a square nut to a heat insert. I modified it further and added heat inserts for the upper threaded fittings as well, and then used that part in place of the original. So as you work through this chapter, it's a bit like doing a cool erector set. At this point, I have the rod holders attached to the frame and the rods installed, and the Core XY assembly carriages installed. And those have fairly light feeling metal parts that come out at a 90-degree angle. And so I also checked the angles on those. Wasn't sure if I could confirm that they were exactly 90 degrees or not, and ended up deciding that that was futile. I really couldn't tell for sure, even with my machinist square. And so I'm going to check that by how they fit once the, I call it a gantry, they have a different word for it, the linear rail assembly is attached. That crosses between the right and the left side of the printer and carries the extruder eventually. As you do this assembly, you need to place the upper frame so that things can hang down, and I found the foam packing materials from the parts that had already been unpacked to be perfect for that. So I use a variety of them in different arrangements as I go through these steps. As I mentioned earlier, in an earlier chapter, I believe, I'm using blue Loctite on all of the metal-to-metal screwed attachment points throughout the printer. It was in one of the comments that I read before I started the assembly or after I was partway into the first chapter or so, and I've gone ahead and done that throughout. I even went back and got some blue Loctite in some of the initial frame parts that I had assembled before I decided to do this. This raises an interesting issue with the linear rail, which I'm about to assemble here. It gets attached to a cross piece and is, we're told to attach it loosely, to not tighten down the screws. And also, when you do tighten down the screws in a later step, you do that in a very particular order. You do that from the outsides moving in, alternating side to side. The goal is to get it tight while keeping it being as straight as possible, not distorting it at all. But I'm putting blue Loctite on the screws as I begin to mount this onto the cross piece, and the blue Loctite is going to dry and harden up a bit. And I want it to dry in its final position, not partway tightened, and then I'm going to break it free and tighten it down further later. So I went ahead and did the full tightening at this earlier stage, using the pattern they suggested, starting from the outside, moving in, and working carefully. The printer now has been printing for me for more than 3 months. There's been no issues related to this. I couldn't tell that this was going to create a problem at all in terms of that being perfectly straight, doing it here at this earlier stage instead of later. And for me, it seemed necessary based on what I was doing with the Loctite. Once the linear rail assembly is attached, you move on to the motor mount and belt hardware. This collection of interesting parts that have pulleys that allow you to string the belts in the particular pattern that allows a Core XY system to work. I noted one of the things that I found in the comments was a suggestion to not put the belt tensioners, to not actually mount them as you're stringing the belts, but to leave them loose, to give yourself much more slack as you thread the belts through the various pulleys. It was a wonderful suggestion. I did that, and you can see right now I've just left that first tensioner on the left side loose. It's not attached to its anchor point at the upper left corner or the back left corner of the frame. I did that on both sides and it worked very well. As all these belts meet up in the extruder carrier in the center, I used banker clips to hold them in place temporarily with the very important 5-tooth overlap so that once they're finally clamped to the carriage, they will not pull free once they're put under tension. Speaking of tension, once I had this all assembled and attached the extruder carrier to the carriage, I went ahead and did a first belt tensioning. So I then put the tensioners in place in the back corners. You can see I just done that. And now you can see with the phone, I'm actually doing Prusa's belt tensioning process. I wanted to do it now at this point so that I knew if I was one of those unlucky folks whose belts popped free when they first put them under full tension. Not the case. It worked perfectly, but it was worth testing now so I didn't have to go back and struggle with this once it was already all put together in the printer and I was doing the final tensioning. Eventually, this upper Core XY frame piece inherits quite a bit of wiring, or a few bits. There are wires from both of the motors. There's a wire from the light that gets attached to the frame. And in my case, and in many people's cases, I put the Buddy 3D camera in the printer. I went ahead and included that wire as these cables were run and zip tied in place. So I didn't have to disconnect them and add it at a later point. Remembering to leave about 22 centimeters of free cable at the end so that it will be able to make the jump up to where the Buddy camera actually is magnetized up into the upper part of the frame later. Once the wiring is all laid out and zip tied in place, we're going to move on to mounting this frame on the printer, which we do by placing it on the smooth rods. There's a lot of discussion about being certain that the rods have been seated all the way down in the pockets that are in the rod holder pieces, and measuring ahead of time and marking so you can be certain. I did that. I measured the depth of the pockets. I put tape on the rods. However, once I finally did do the assembly, they seated down easily enough that I could feel them hit the bottoms of the pockets. Having the tape marking that they were fully inserted was helpful, but in the end, for my installation, was not quite necessary. I still did, in essence, a third way to check that they'd been fully seated. I used my iPhone and the good digital level that I have on it and measured, checked what the level was at the heat bed and in the bottom frame, and then compared that to the apparent level up on the upper frame that had just been fully seated onto the rods. Everything matched, and so I had a lot of confidence that I had things fully seated and could proceed. From there, this chapter gets a bit like the previous chapter, which is you're running wires and connecting them to the boards in the back of the printer. There was one suggestion from the community that I followed at this point, which is in getting some of the cables through the fairly tight holes, pop the rubber grommet out that you installed earlier. Still have the wires go through that grommet, of course. And then after you've gotten the heads of the wires through, you can put the grommet back into place. That worked well. I did that. That just about finishes up chapter 5, though you will see right at the end of this video that I pulled the bed stop back off. The modified version that I used, which is printed in PCCF with heat inserts instead of square nuts, had one of the heat inserts come free. I hadn't done a good job in the way I modified it when I added heat inserts on the upper screw holes as well. So I fixed that, reprinted it, and reinstalled it in the next chapter. Next up in chapter 6 is the extruder assembly, another fairly meaty chapter. And as always, the Hariboos will go to Carolyn. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and we'll see you in Chapter 6.